Alrighty, hey Dale, sorry for the delay in getting you this info. I figured the easiest thing to do to explain the 504 and 505 is just record a quick mini class, so to speak. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so these two forms, by the way, are separate documents. I just combined them into one PDF. So first one is the 504. So paragraph one, the buyer's agent is just going to put the address of the property that the buyer is selling, and then they're going to check, is it a primary residence, second home, etc. And then also, how's it sold, and is it already under contract? Is it going to be listed? And if so, by who and what company? Is it a FSBO, etc. Paragraph 2 deals with the buyer's sale deadline, which means when do they have to sell the property by? There's one of two choices the buyer can choose. One is the first one, it says no later than blank calendar days prior to the closing date. Or the one I normally choose is on the closing date. So whatever the closing date is of the home they are purchasing, that would be the same deadline by which they have to sell their current house. It says in this next sentence, should the sale of the buyer's property not close by the buyer's sale deadline, buyer may terminate this contract by notice to the seller delivered no later than blank. I usually put 2 calendar days here. And so if it doesn't close by the buyer sale deadline, they have 2 days. And then I put the same number in this one. So 2 days here as well. I don't check either of these boxes, because if you check either of these boxes, then the seller starts thinking, well, can the buyer purchase my home without selling their property? Paragraph 3 details out a few things. Basically, the buyer's obligations and duties. A is they have to make good faith efforts to sell their property. They have to inform the seller and the listing broker of pertinent information regarding the sale of the buyer's property. Or they would direct brokers and law firms to disclose pertinent information. And then there's 2 time frames you have to fill out, letters D and E. And I usually put 2 for both of those, and it can be whatever, the buyer likes and the seller agrees to. But it just says within 2 calendar days of contract, deliver to seller and brokers copy of each contract. So you have to get them a copy of the contract on the buyer's house. And then once the property is closed, the seller and the listing broker give the seller and listing broker notice that the buyer's property is closed. And really, you wouldn't give the seller notice. It would be the listing broker. And if the buyer doesn't do one of these things, then the seller can seek remedies. Examples are terminate the contract or litigation or whatever. Item number 4 is the most important part of this form. And what it says is that seller can continue to market the property and can accept any offer as a backup offer. Now, of course, in the MLS, it does make a note that MLS rules may require categorization of seller's listing as other than active. Of course, in our Greenville MLS and the other MLSs, once a property goes under contract, the listing agent has to update it to either contingency, contract, or pending. This blank is probably the most important blank in this whole form, because it says if the seller were to get another offer, and once they deliver notice to the buyer of that offer, then the buyer has blank calendar days to choose either option A or B. If I'm representing the buyer, I usually ask for 2 to 3 days. I want to get as much time as possible. If I'm representing the seller, I'm trying to get 1 day at the most. But let's pretend we're representing the buyer. So we put 2 days here. And so within 2 days of getting notice that the seller has gotten another offer, the buyer has to do one of 2 things. They either have to show the seller that their property is under contract and it's scheduled to close by the buyer's sale deadline, which is the deadline in paragraph 2 up here. And the contract they have on their property can only have financing contingencies and repair contingencies. So it cannot be contingent on another home selling. Or if their property is not under contract, they can remove the sale contingency, meaning they can tell the seller, well, you know what, I will go ahead and buy your home without having to sell mine. And they have to prove that they can do so. either by showing the seller a pre-approval letter that says that it's not contingent on their home selling, or somehow if they have the cash available, showing the seller proof of funds. If the buyer can't do either one of those things, if the buyer can do one of those things, then they remain in the primary contract position, so they can't get kicked out of the contract. And then the seller could only accept that other offer as a backup contract. If the buyer can't do one of those things, then obviously the seller can terminate the contract. So that is Form 504. And then Form 505 is rarely used. I have never really seen a listing agent use this form, but this is the right form to use to notify the buyer's agent that the seller has received another offer. At the top, it just says that, it reminds everybody that the contract's contingent on the closing of the buyer's property. And so in accordance with that, this following notice is being delivered. And what it says is that this form is seller notice to the buyer that an acceptable subsequent offer has been received. And then the first section, the seller has to choose one of the two choices. One, it does not contain a buyer sale contingency and the seller is considering accepting this offer. Or two, the subsequent offer was accepted already as a backup contract. And then once the buyer gets this form, they have a few options that they have to choose. So if they wish to remain the primary contract, then they have to attach evidence, basically the contract, to the seller that their property is under contract with no contingencies other than financing and repairs. Or the two options is they can remove their contingency and show the seller that they can buy this home without selling their house, either with a loan or with cash. And if they don't want to remain as the primary contract, then they can choose to become a backup contract, although I haven't seen that happen too often, but if so, they would check this box. Or they can terminate the contract is the other option. And then of course it says that if the buyer doesn't make any choice and no delivery by the deadline, then either party can terminate the contract. And then everybody signs and dates and puts the time. So those are the two forms. Like I said, 505 is not used too often, but it should be. That's best practice. It goes along with 504 and it addresses, a bunch of things. So hopefully that explains it. And let me stop this. If you have any other questions, just give me a ring. Thanks.